If you grew up in the 80s, you remember the first time you heard The Beautiful Ones. That moment when Prince's voice cracks with desperation, when he screams the question that breaks your heart even if you don't know why. For decades, people wondered who inspired that raw, aching vulnerability. Music critics wrote essays. Fans debated. But the woman who actually lived that song stayed silent. Susannah Melvoin knew the truth behind every tortured note, every plea, every moment of surrender in that masterpiece. She knew because she was there when it was written, when the pain was fresh, when the love was real enough to build kingdoms and destroy them just as fast. And years later, when a single letter arrived in the mail, she finally understood what Prince had been trying to tell her all along. The song was never about winning her heart. It was about saying goodbye. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, please subscribe to support more exclusive content about music's greatest legends. Minneapolis, 1983. The music scene was exploding with a sound nobody had heard before. Synthesizers mixed with funk, rock collided with soul, and at the center of it all stood a man who refused to be categorized. Prince Rogers Nelson was building an empire, and he needed soldiers who could match his vision. Susannah Melvoin walked into that world through her twin brother Jonathan, a brilliant musician who had already earned Prince's respect. But when Prince first saw Susannah, something shifted in the carefully controlled universe he had constructed around himself. She wasn't like the others who orbited his world. She didn't fawn or freeze or try to impress him with manufactured coolness. Susannah had her own fire, her own talent, her own refusal to be diminished by anyone's spotlight, no matter how bright it burned. She was a classically trained musician, a singer with a voice that could cut through any arrangement, and a woman who understood that genius came with a price. Prince recognized all of this within minutes of meeting her. And for a man who built walls higher than anyone could climb, that recognition was both thrilling and terrifying. Their connection was immediate but complicated. Prince was dating someone else. Susannah was navigating her own path in the music industry. But there was something magnetic in the way they circled each other. The way conversations about chord progressions turned into conversations about everything else. The way silence between them felt more honest than words with anyone else. By early 1984, the inevitable had happened. They were together, and the music that came out of that union would define an era. The revolution was more than a band. It was Prince's answer to everyone who said he couldn't create timeless music with a full ensemble, that his genius only worked in isolation. With Susannah now part of that inner circle, along with Wendy Melvoin, her twin, the group became a family in ways that transcended professional collaboration. They rehearsed until their fingers bled. They fought over arrangements with the passion of people who cared desperately about getting it right. And they created music that would outlive all of them. Susannah watched Prince work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He would spend 20-hour sessions in the studio, fueled by nothing but creative vision and an inexplicable ability to function on almost no sleep. She saw the perfectionist who would record a guitar solo 50 times until it matched the sound in his head. She witnessed the collaborator who could pull greatness out of musicians who didn't know they had it in them. And she experienced the lover who could be tender in private moments, but who never fully let anyone see the scared child beneath the constructed persona. Living with genius is not easy. Prince demanded everything from everyone around him, but he demanded most from himself. There were moments of extraordinary connection, nights when the music stopped and the person emerged, vulnerable and searching. But there were also stretches of emotional distance, times when Prince retreated so far into his own world that even Susannah, who knew him better than almost anyone, couldn't reach him. The man who could bare his soul in a song lyric struggled to maintain intimacy in the quiet moments when there was no performance to hide behind. When Purple Rain exploded across the cultural landscape in 1984, everything changed. The album dominated the charts for 24 consecutive weeks. The film turned Prince into a movie star. The title track became an anthem that would define a generation's understanding of longing and transcendence. Suddenly, the man Susannah loved was no longer just hers to know. He belonged to the world, and the world wanted every piece of him they could get. Success at that level breaks things. It reveals cracks that might have stayed hidden in smaller circumstances. Prince had always struggled with the balance between his public persona and his private self. But now the weight of global fame made that struggle impossible to ignore. He became more controlling, more isolated, more convinced that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Susannah tried to hold space for both the icon and the man. But the distance between those two versions of Prince was growing wider every day. The tours were massive, the performances legendary. 80,000 people screaming your name every night does something to your sense of reality. It makes ordinary life feel small, makes normal human connection seem insufficient. Prince was addicted to that rush, that validation, that proof of his own importance. And Susannah, watching from the wings, began to understand that she was competing not just with other women or other priorities, but with an entire identity that Prince had built and that now seemed to be consuming him completely. By 1985, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. Prince was working on Around the World in a Day, an album that would deliberately reject the commercial formula of Purple Rain in favor of something more experimental, more personal, more deliberately challenging to his audience. The creative process was grueling, and the emotional toll on everyone around him was severe. Arguments that once resolved quickly now festered. Misunderstandings that could have been cleared up with a single conversation instead built into walls of resentment. Susannah knew something was changing, but she couldn't quite name it. Prince was pulling away, not all at once, but in increments so small that each one seemed manageable, until you looked back and realized how far the distance had grown. He stopped sharing certain parts of his creative process. He made decisions about the band without consultation. He spent more time alone in Paisley Park, the studio complex he was building that would become both his creative sanctuary and his emotional fortress. There were other women, rumors that circulated with the casual cruelty of an industry that treated relationships as disposable. Susannah heard the whispers, but tried to focus on what she knew, what she could see, what Prince told her in the moments when he still let her in. But trust, once questioned, becomes a fragile thing. And Prince was not a man who reassured easily, or who believed he owed explanations to anyone. Even the woman who had stood beside him through the most transformative period of his career. The recording of Parade in 1986 should have been a triumph. The album was sophisticated, layered, a sonic exploration that proved Prince's range extended far beyond the Minneapolis sound that had made him famous. But the sessions were tense, marked by power struggles and creative disagreements that sometimes felt more personal than professional. Prince was asserting control in ways that left little room for collaboration. And the revolution, which had always functioned as a genuine ensemble, was starting to fracture under the weight of one man's vision overriding everyone else's contributions. Susannah was still there, still contributing, still trying to bridge the gap between the man she loved and the icon he had become. But she was exhausted. Living in someone else's shadow, no matter how brilliant that someone is, wears you down. She had her own musical ambitions, her own creative voice that was getting lost in the constant noise of Prince's output. And she was beginning to realize that Prince might not be capable of being an equal partner to anyone, that his need for absolute control extended into every corner of his life, including love. The conversations they had during this period were circular, frustrating. Prince would acknowledge her feelings, promise to do better, then disappear into the studio for 3 days straight without a word. He loved her. Of that she was certain. But he loved music more, or perhaps he loved the version of himself that music allowed him to be more than he loved, the vulnerable, imperfect person he actually was beneath all the costumes and mystique. And Susannah was beginning to understand that you cannot save someone from themselves, no matter how much you love them. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in late 1986, months after the small fractures had become irreparable breaks, weeks after Susannah had finally admitted to herself that staying was destroying her. The envelope was addressed in Prince's distinctive handwriting, precise and controlled, even when the emotions behind it were anything but. She held it for a long time before opening it, knowing somehow that this would be the final word on everything they had been to each other. The letter was not what she expected. There was no anger, no blame, no attempt to convince her she was wrong about needing to leave. Instead, there was something more devastating: clarity. Prince wrote about his own limitations, about knowing he was not built for the kind of partnership she deserved, about understanding that his relationship with music would always come first, and that asking someone to accept permanent second place was unfair. He wrote about loving her more than he had loved anyone, and precisely because of that love, understanding he had to let her go. But it was the final paragraph that broke her heart completely. Prince referenced songs they had worked on together, moments in the studio when their creative energies had aligned so perfectly it felt like touching something transcendent. He wrote that those moments were the closest he had ever come to believing in soulmates, to thinking maybe he could be more than just his music. And then he admitted what she had suspected, but never wanted to believe: that he had been saying goodbye to her for months, maybe longer, through every song lyric, every performance, every moment of distance he had created between them. The letter was not the beginning of the end. It was the confirmation that the end had already happened, quietly and irrevocably, long before either of them had the courage to name it. Susannah left Prince's orbit in early 1987, right as he was disbanding the revolution and retreating further into the controlled isolation of Paisley Park. The breakup was not dramatic or public. They simply stopped being in each other's lives, stopped sharing the daily moments that had once defined their connection. Prince threw himself into music with even more intensity, if that was possible, releasing album after album, building his vault of unreleased recordings, proving to himself and the world that he didn't need anyone to create. But friends noticed something had shifted. Prince rarely spoke about Susannah directly, but her ghost haunted his music. Songs from the Sign of the Times era and beyond carried echoes of what they had shared and lost. He dated other women, even married twice, but those who knew him well understood that Prince had made a choice. Long ago, perhaps even before he met Susannah, that music would always be his primary relationship, and everything else would be secondary. That choice gave the world extraordinary art, but it came at a personal cost that became more visible as the years passed. Susannah built her own life, her own music career, her own identity separate from the Prince Rogers Nelson story. She rarely gave interviews about their relationship, protecting both their privacy and her own complicated feelings about those years. When she did speak, It was with the perspective of someone who had loved deeply and lost clearly, who understood that some people are not meant for conventional partnerships, no matter how much love exists between them. She never regretted their time together, but she also never pretended it had been anything other than what it was: beautiful, painful, transformative, and ultimately impossible. Decades later, when Prince died in 2016, Susannah was among the thousands who mourned not just the artist, but the man. She knew things about him that the screaming fans never would, had seen vulnerability that the carefully constructed public persona never revealed. And she carried the knowledge that she had been loved by someone who struggled to love in any traditional sense, who gave everything to his art because giving everything to a person terrified him in ways that even he couldn't fully articulate. The letters she received all those years ago remained private, its contents known only to her. But its impact echoed through both their lives, a permanent marker of the moment when love proved insufficient against the larger forces that shaped Prince's existence. She had been right to leave, and he had been right to let her go. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is acknowledge that what you have to offer and what the other person needs are two different things, and no amount of desire can bridge that gap. The Beautiful Ones, the song that had haunted a generation with its desperate vulnerability, took on new meaning for those who knew the real story. It was never a plea for Susannah to choose him. It was Prince's acknowledgement that he could never fully choose her or anyone over the music that defined his existence. The heartbreak in his voice was real, the pain genuine, but it was the pain of someone who understood his own limitations and knew that understanding would not change them. He was asking her to be beautiful with him, knowing he would never give her everything she deserved. And the tragedy was that she almost said yes anyway. Today, when people listen to Purple Rain or Sign of the Times or any of the masterpieces that came from that era, they are hearing the sound of genius, yes, but also the sound of sacrifice. Every perfect note, every innovative arrangement, every moment of transcendent creativity came at a cost. Prince paid that cost willingly, perhaps inevitably, but the people who loved him paid it too. Susannah Melvoin was one of them, a woman who gave years of her life to supporting and loving someone who could never quite love anything more than the music. The letter sits somewhere still, words on paper that capture a truth both devastating and somehow beautiful in its honesty. It represents the moment when Prince dropped the mystique long enough to admit what he could and could not be, to acknowledge the difference between loving someone and being able to build a life with them. And for Susannah, it remains a reminder of everything they shared and everything that was always impossible, no matter how much they wanted it to work. The 80s ended. The revolution disbanded. Prince continued creating until the day he died, leaving behind a vault of unreleased material that will take decades to fully explore. But somewhere in that vast catalog of genius, in between the hits and the deep cuts and the songs that never saw official release, there are notes that belong to Susannah Melvoin, pieces of their shared history, preserved in melody and lyrics, telling the story of a love that burned bright and ended inevitably, leaving both of them changed forever.